It is a tragedy, a repeated tragedy, that the greatest storehouses of man's early documents have been destroyed, often deliberately in fires, such as the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, which suffered destruction on the orders of 3 different Roman emperors. We also have the Library of Constantinople that was destroyed by Christian crusaders. Solon was very liberal with his criticisms. He set about reforming trade. Sons were legally responsible for looking after their aged parents. He also ruled that a leader could be elected for only 1 term, but it would be a 10-year term, so they could think long term. The guy is brilliant. Now, this description alone from this very credible witness would rule out almost every speculative find that's been ever recorded about where Atlantis is. 2 details struck me immediately. The emphasis of a very specific date, which in our terms would be 9600 BC, is amazingly close to the climatic data that's pointing to a major event in 9620 BC. Hello everyone, this episode, number 6 in our series, we're going to look at the myth of Atlantis.
Previously, you said Earth suffered similar impacts as our moon and Mars. Right?
Yes. Both of these, we've seen many pictures by satellites of the moon and Mars. And they're covered in craters, so many that they're actually overlapping. But we probably thought that our planet has suffered less. And that's because our activities erode the remains of craters. We build, we farm. We also have large areas covered in deserts. We have ice caps, and 75% is covered by ocean. So that hides a lot. But this has led to a new technique for pinpointing undersea meteor craters, which is proving incredibly helpful, very relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Before revealing what has been found, let me recount some research which led me initially to speculatively guess where I think a large impact had occurred into sea. Like many people, I thought the story of Atlantis was a pure myth, something that people latched onto. There seemed to be stories that I discovered Atlantis in Bermuda or in somewhere in the Caribbean or in Indonesia. It was a topic for
science fiction.
Yeah. But I started looking seriously after reviewing information about 2 Egyptian temples, the Temple of Edfu and the Temple of Sais. Interestingly, these many temples, I think they've been completely misunderstood by historians and archaeologists. Temples were close to being a cross between a palace and the site where those that could write, the scribes, administered the state for the high priest. The high priest was often the king. The king would hold the title of high priest. It was the way he legitimized his reign, his power over his people, because he had been ordained by a higher divine power. So when we talk about temples, we're talking about people who really were performing like civil servants in those days. So it was a repository of documentation, a repository of learning, and it was the main source of writing and recording taxes, if nothing else. So the Edfu temple had got into a poor state and was completely rebuilt during the 3rd century BC. This temple housed an amazing collection of scrolls, apparently, but the priests did us an enormous favour. They transcribed as many of their most important scrolls as they could all over every surface of the temple. Unfortunately, enthusiastic early Coptic Christians in about the 3rd century AD decided that this was all a bit pagan and burnt all the scrolls. Fortunately, the desert encroached, the temple was abandoned and covered in sand. And it wasn't rediscovered until, I think, 1890 by a French team of archaeologists. And because all the surfaces were covered in inscriptions, it triggered enormous interest. There's at least 2 people devoted their entire working life to transcribing and translating these inscriptions. And they produced enormous tomes, sort of 20-part large books, setting out all these inscriptions. The only trouble is they weren't able to consider the layout of the material, so it is thought to be rather jumbled. There are individual stories, but nobody can work out how it all fits. Then about 15 to 20 years ago, a project was launched by, I think, Hamburg University initially, to completely recatalogue all of the inscriptions. And they found a lot more. As the Edfu temple priests had used every available surface to inscribe documents. It was that important for them. Later, I think this project currently is being done by Göttingen University, and they're beginning to start publishing very soon. They've focused a lot on trying to work out the totality of the story of history and lay it out in a chronological way. But there was sufficient, even before they published anything, to me, to show that it was recording really catastrophic events long ago. It referred back to a time when Egypt was completely devastated by water that swept up the Nile, demolishing all the villages, settlements, irrigation, leaving total devastation. Then it tells of some wise men, the 7 sages, which is a common motive in many histories, emerging, led by people such as Horus, Thoth, and Ptah, characters who formed a very major role in the Egyptian theology. They set about rebuilding. Now that sparked my interest because it sounded to me like the impact of a tsunami from an impact in the Mediterranean sweeping up the Nile Valley. I was also looking at the records of the Temple of Sais. Now, not that much has survived today, but the story that forms the bedrock of the idea of Atlantis actually comes from an very credible source. The Temple of Sais also proved very informative from Greek sources rather than surviving records. Almost none of the modern stories about Atlantis refer to the Greek origins. People like Plato, Herodotus, and a number of other Greek philosophers and historians are quoted, but rarely do they refer to the common source that these philosophers actually refer to, and that is a gentleman named Solon. Sadly, none of the original writings of Solon, which were quite extensive from the quotes that we do have, none of them have survived. Indeed, it is a tragedy, a repeated tragedy, that the greatest storehouses of man's early documents have been destroyed, often deliberately in fires, such as the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, which suffered destruction on the orders of 3 different Roman emperors. Incredible vandalism. We also have the Library of Constantinople, that was destroyed by Christian crusaders in the Fourth Crusade, 1204, and the job was finished off by Muslim armies in 1453. Totally destroyed. We then have Nanaland, a repository of the largest library of Buddhist writings, which was destroyed by fire in 1193, and the Library of the Forbidden City that was destroyed in 1900 during the Boxer Rebellion. So it's pretty sad that we've lost such a wealth of man's earlier knowledge. But when I read translations of Plato's quotations, it suddenly piqued my interest. Solon was a polymath, a very credible source of information. It's interesting to spend a few moments looking at Solon's background. Basically, he was the guy who invented democracy in Athens. He was the son of a very wealthy noble, and he's quite opinionated. At this time, it's a bit about, I think he was born around 630 BC, and at that time, Athens, the city-state, was constantly warring with other neighbouring city-states, as the Greeks did. But unfortunately, at that time, Athens kept losing all its battles. And Solon was very liberal with his criticisms of the management of the generals and so forth. So because his father was very influential, maybe enemies of them decided that they would put Solon in charge of the army. Good way to shut him up. Well, Solon introduced many reforms to the army, and the moment he took over, it won every single battle. So after a few years, the population of, or the controllers of Athens decided, why don't we make him boss? So he became king, prince, mayor of Athens. And he introduced an astonishing array of reforms. First of all, he introduced full adult male suffrage. No votes for women in those days, unfortunately. He set about reforming trade, weights and measures, the legal code. He made ordinances that every father was legally responsible for ensuring all their sons learned a trade. And also, sons were legally responsible for looking after their aged parents. He also ruled that a leader could be elected for only one term, but it would be a 10-year term, so they could think long term. The guy is brilliant. So the inevitable happened at the end of his 10-year term. Everybody said, wow, you're so good, we want you back, we want you to continue. He said, if I start changing to meet your requirements, it will undermine all my reforms. So I'm going. In fact, to make sure I'm going to do a world tour. In those days, a tour around the Mediterranean. And he recorded, he went to see many kings and princes all around the Mediterranean. Naturally, ended up seeing the Pharaoh, as you do. And whilst he was in Egypt, he visited the Temple of Sais. Now, what is very interesting, or interested me, it is believed that the year in which he visited the Temple of Sais would have been what we call 600 BC. When he visited, the priests excitedly told him that they were celebrating the 9,000th anniversary of a disaster related to Atlantis. And Solon's writings reflect what he learned from these priests. Basically, his understanding was that a sailing ship had returned to Egypt with some survivors from a disaster. They had encountered terrible weather, and when they'd finally thought that they'd reached their home port, their capital city of Atlantis, they found entrance to the harbour was prevented by sandbars and a lot of vegetation and broken trees and things. And when they tried to probe inland, they found the city was devastated, gone. So they sailed back into the Mediterranean and came to Egypt. Solon also recorded some very interesting, quite specific data about Atlantis that he learned from these priests at the Temple of Sais. He explained that the city, a magnificent city, etc., but distinctively had these concentric docks. So ships could load and unload in these circular quays, and in between were their factories and warehouses and homes, etc. The city also had magnificent gardens and many hot springs. He described it as lying in the middle of a wide plain on both sides with very fertile crops and stuff. And access from the sea was to the south through a deep estuary, whilst to the north there was mountains visible in the distance. Now, this description alone from this very credible witness would rule out almost every speculative find that's been ever recorded about where Atlantis is. Two details struck me immediately. The emphasis of a very specific date, which in our terms would be 9600 BC, is amazingly close to the climatic data that's pointing to a major event in 9620 BC. That's got to be more than a coincidence. The other detail is clear clues as to its location. Then came another extraordinary discovery, which links very well with this. That's the Ricac structure. And this was discovered by a French aviator, I think 1932, thereabouts. And he saw this astonishing geological formation of concentric circles in western Mauritania. It's huge. It's about 45 kilometers diameter. It's big. It wasn't subject to any scientific evaluation until an expedition led by a guy called Monod, I think in 1952. And his description includes the fact that he found spectacular hydrothermal features. Interestingly, whilst I was just making some notes ready for this broadcast, I came across a Google AI answer as to when was the Ricac structure discovered. And it shows you the dangers of placing much credibility on AI. Because the answer that came back was, the Ricac structure was discovered in June 1965 by the astronauts of Gemini 4. So be careful when you rely on AI. The natural features of the Ricac structure are quite interesting. This huge area of concentric rings with deep salt deposits between the rings, which suggests there used to be seawater there. But a force, which had only been water, has scoured the area right down to the bedrock. But the direction from which this force has come is from the northeast, out of the Sahara.
That sounds really impossible.
Yeah. Certainly when people started looking at it, it was just crazy. But I started thinking whether a meteor impact accounting for clear evidence of massive climate change around 9620 BC and the information from the Temple of Sais dated to 9600 BC and the undated records of the Edfu temple, were they all pointing to the same thing? Egypt devastated by a huge wave of water, which could also have gone across the Sahara. Sounds mad. Looking at the topography, I wondered whether, if a meteor had slammed into the Mediterranean, it could have created a tsunami, which could have both come and hit the Nile Valley and swept up the Nile Valley, but also have come across this very shallow part of Tunisia, salt flats of the Chotel Djerid, and momentum taking it, funneling between the Atlas Mountains and the Agar Mountains. Once it got to here, which is only about 300 meters up, it would have gravity taking it down the Tamanrasset River basin, straight across the Rikek structure and out to sea. Point of detail, where the Tamanrasset is now completely dried up, but where it used to flow, there's a vast amount of spoil in like a delta formed beyond that outflow area. Stretches for 300 kilometers from the coast, 300 kilometers, and it's about 100 kilometers wide. So an awful lot of sand, maybe buildings, got washed down there. I had speculated that for the angles to work, a meteor impact to the east of Sicily might have occurred. No proof. Soon, I found other anomalies consistent with a body of seawater surging southwards from the coast of North Africa. Timing consistent with a meteor that might have triggered a tsunami around 9620 BC. Midway between Tunisia and the Nile, this coast of Libya would have seen, if there was a meteor impact that created a tsunami, water course all the way south. That is an enormous distance, it's about 1,000 kilometers. But we found evidence of seawater in two locations in northern Chad, seawater being there about 9000 BC. What is the evidence? At Trau au Natron, there is a crater of an ancient volcano. It has large deposits of salt and marine mollusks, which have been analysed and dated to between 15,000 and 8,000 BC. Admittedly, that's a very wide range, but 9,600 sits in the middle comfortably. Kasai here is the highest volcano in North Africa. The last eruption of Kasai is dated between about 12,800 BC and 10,400 BC. Yet in this arid climate, the lower slopes of the volcano show incredible water erosion. For water, seawater, Trau au Natron, to penetrate 1,000 kilometers from the coast in substantial volume to fill crater of an ancient volcano, that suggests a major tsunami, which would also be sufficient to cross Tunisia and reach the Tamanrasset River basin. It was at this point I had heard some amazing news. I was preparing to give a lecture in Melbourne in early 2024, and a novel technique which had been used to pinpoint underwater impact craters, no matter how deep the water, had revealed a huge impact site in the Mediterranean. In fact, the impact site was not very far from my guess. I guessed just east of Sicily. It was just off the Greek island of Kefalonia. Two enormous impact craters. One is 25 kilometers wide, the other is 50 kilometers wide. Now think about that. The Hiawatha one that devastated North American continent was 31. Here we have a 25 plus a 50 right next to it. The twin impact is thought to have been created by the meteor in its inbound journey becoming more fragile and splitting in two just as it impacted. A simulation of this impact indicates that it created a tsunami 800 meters high. That would be a wall of water that might well have easily gone through the rising land between the Atlas Mountains and the Hagar Mountains. It would only need to crest a 300 meter level and then it would be going downhill and accelerating. In the next episode, we'll look at the technique for identifying undersea impact craters. Thank you. Until the next episode.